You could make an argument that the origins of a lot of European expansion actually lies in privation. If you think about how much the Black Death decimates Europe, just the century before the Iberians start to move into the Atlantic world, a sense of privation also in Europe from feeling completely cut off from the valuable things that particularly Asian markets had to offer. At first, spices come from somewhere out there, loosely called India. But it's only later when Europeans, a small number of Europeans, start traveling through the Mongol Empire that they start to specify where these places are. And then Marco Polo writes in his travels, not having been there, that the island of Java is the richest place in the world. All the treasures that you might want are there. And Christopher Columbus is reading this, he's annotating it. We have archival documents showing his margin notes. And it's like a siren.
How did a bumper crop of grass power the Mongol Empire? Today, I'm joined by Sunil Amrith, author of The Burning Earth, to talk about what a focus on the natural environment can reveal about human history. We talk about what really won the First World War, what Marco Polo thought about Java, and why the Americans were wrong about rice eaters. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Sunil Amrith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Ash.
So I suppose the first question is, why did you want to write a history of the world from an environmental perspective? What was the seed of that idea?
The seed was really wanting to reckon with how we have arrived at this point of planetary crisis, and from a conviction that we really do need to take a long view about the many tangled paths that have brought us here.
And so did you come at it with a particular interest in one historical period and branched outwards? Or was it that you had this method that was developed somewhere else, then you were applying it onto history?
It's a really interesting question. I am a historian by training, and everything else that I've written is very much history. My specialty is very much in studying the modern world, sort of 19th and 20th century. So for me, the adventure and the stretch here was actually to take that much longer term perspective that I do in The Burning Earth.
Well, yeah, because you're going back to, the Mongol hordes and you're like, okay, all right, they don't have, you don't have newspapers, you don't have newsreels that you can go back to. I mean, what were the most enjoyable sources for you to get your teeth into?
Oh, that's a great question. There were those that I was used to working with, which I continued to find really fascinating in the process of researching The Burning Earth. Rachel Carson's correspondence, for example, which we're very lucky to actually have on campus at Yale where I teach. And so to see how she's putting together...
Who's Rachel Carson, just for our audience?
Rachel Carson, who wrote one of the most important, I think, environmental texts of the 20th century called Silent Spring in 1963, which, at least in the US, I think really galvanized what becomes the environmental movement.
And people who've watched Three Body Problem might be familiar with it because it features quite prominently in it. And it's basically a sort of, it looks at the use of chemicals and pesticides and looks at what it's doing to the earth and nature's bounty and says, one day there's going to be the Silent Spring where there is nothing in bloom anymore. That's right.
And so prescient in so many ways, I think.
Did you feel when you were... looking at something like Silent Spring and then looking back through how, in previous ages, even back hundreds of years, that this was an anxiety that had come up before, this idea of what we're doing isn't sustainable and we're killing the very earth that sustains us?
I think there have always been seeds of that perspective. And I think one of the things I've tried to weave through The Burning Earth is other ways of seeing the world, which go back hundreds of years. And one of the most interesting parts of the book to write for me, because it was a process of discovery, was thinking about 17th century England and all these fenland villagers who are protesting enclosure and they're protesting the drainage of the fens. And what's interesting to me is the language in which they're doing it. They are actually saying this endangers the ecology that is absolutely essential to our community's survival and flourishing. And I think there are moments throughout the Burning Earth, where indigenous groups, people across the colonized world are making these kinds of arguments, not in the language of modern science, but very much in this language that what we're doing is not going to end well.
I mean, I want to come back to the protest against the enclosures just a little bit later. But I guess, right at the beginning of the book, you write about the Charter of the Forest, which is sort of the less famous sister of the Magna Carta. Everyone knows about the Magna Carta. No one knows about the Charter of the Forest. Why was the Charter of the Forest so important?
The Charter of the Forest was very important because I think it's one of the first articulations of this idea that access to nature, if I can put it that way, is really important for our political rights, for our economic well-being. And what the Charter of the Forest did was it actually rolled back some of the overweening powers that the monarchy had taken in claiming the royal forest. It actually disafforested or took out of the realm of the royal forest various chunks of land and acknowledged that local people had rights of use in those lands. But then a new battle starts because in a sense, the Charter of the Forest also opens up the possibility of claiming as private property some of those forests. And so what you see is a real struggle which plays itself out over several hundred years in this country.
I mean, I know I'm jumping forward in time quite a bit, but when I was reading about the Charter of the Forest, it made me think about modern conservation. And this is something which the royals of England love. They love going like, well, we've bought up a swathe of Africa and we're protecting it for the rhino. But what that means is that you either privatize this land and it's predominantly, white owners in African countries, which is, spoiler alert, not a great historical track record of doing that. Or you've got a model of conservation where it's like you have a militarized border. So then when local people who tend to be poor say well, I actually want to keep collecting firewood, thanks. It's well, you're now going to get the shit kicked out of you by this deputized police force. Are there these mirror images for you from medieval period and modern conservation?
Absolutely. And I think great example from these enclosures in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but you see it in India as well. You see it in the power that the forest department in India first acquires during the colonial period and then retains after independence. And very often Adivasi communities are being forcibly evicted from the lands that are their homelands, the lands that they depend on. And I think we see this pattern all over the world, which is why I was really struck by the kinds of arguments that were coming out. And again, this is to jump forward right into the later parts of the Burning Earth. But Chico Mendes' movement in the Amazon in the 1980s, so many of the participants in that movement were absolutely insistent that this is not conservation. This is about the entwined well-being of human societies and nature. Conservation is about excluding people from nature. And this is a very different way of thinking about it. And that line of thinking too, I think we can trace back.
I mean, one of the things, again, that comes up really early is that you look at the Charter of the Forest and you compare it to the 2001 Earth Charter. And you say, unlike the Charter of the Forest, the Earth Charter is just here are some nice things we'd like to do. There are no enforceable provisions. There's no, adjudicating body. There's no enforcement, nothing. Is there a part of you which maybe feels a little bit sympathetic towards the idea of an environmental authoritarianism, or an environmental authority at least, something which has got power above and beyond national governments to protect the planet's environment in some way?
I think that's a tempting idea, Ash. It is one that I recoil from as soon as I think about how that sort of top-down power has been used to the detriment of both people and environments. Looking back, I absolutely believe that there needs to be more of a structure of policymaking, sharing of information. I believe that all of these UN bodies need more teeth than they currently have, but they're so dramatically underfunded. This is not about creating an environmental authoritarianism, but just giving these bodies the resources they need to do their work. I mean, that would be a first step.
I mean, I guess what would that work be? And what would they be resourced to do is my question.
Yes. I have no problem with them being resourced to set goals. It is the idea that an environmental sort of authority would be enforcing those goals that makes me worry about how that would work out, because that would then take those goals and their enforcement further and further out of democratic hands and out of democratic decision making.
We're definitely going to come back to how democracy relates to the themes of the book in a second. But I think to go back to, I guess, this idea of use rights for natural resources is there something for you about a difference between, local people who've been there for generations and generations using a natural resource versus either an encroaching population, a conquering force, a colonizing force, and then separate again from something like a business interest? Is there something inherently different between these three things for you? Or is there always the risk that even those local people will misuse or push beyond the point of sustainability?
I like the way you frame that, Ash, because I think that we are sometimes in danger of romanticizing how local people or indigenous people interact with nature. And I think that in itself can be very condescending in the way that we speak about people being closer to nature than others. I think it's a question of scale. I think if we look at the historical record, relatively small communities of people tend not to overshoot the limits of sustainability, if we can use that modern term, partly out of self-interest, and partly just because of the scale and the purposes for which they are making the best and most diverse possible use they can of their ecosystems. I think what shifts with a conquering force or external investors is that wish for maximum profit as quickly as possible. I think that shifts the stakes very significantly.
So I guess I'm interested in how environmentalism relates to something like degrowth and also relates to something like population growth. So is there an idea that people have to be less densely populated in order for there to be a sustainable relationship to the environment? And how can you square that with, the drive towards urbanization? I mean, you're a city boy as well. You're from Singapore, right?
I am.
You're one of us, soft-handed.
I'm a city boy, and I actually think that's one of the things which makes The Burning Earth a little bit different. A lot of environmental writing, including environmental writing that I deeply love and admire, comes from a place of deep connection with the natural world. I didn't grow up with that at all. I grew up in high-rise apartment blocks. I grew up without thinking I had any connection with the natural world at all. And in some ways, when I was a young person, I was thinking about where my commitments lay, the things that really I was passionate about. I did see environmental concerns as secondary. Social justice, political equality, these were the kinds of struggles towards the end of the 20th century which were very much on my mind. They are the struggles that inspired me to want to study history and to understand how we got to this place. And I think it was a gradual process for me, which culminated in me writing The Burning Earth, of trying to put those pieces together and trying to understand environmental concerns as inseparable from a whole range of broader struggles for justice and equality. And so just that is a preface to your question about the relationship between environmentalism and density. The Burning Earth is, I think, a very anti-Malthusian book. There is a strain of thinking... And
for people who aren't familiar with Malthus,
the idea that overpopulation is the fundamental challenge that we face. And that is a view that one hears articulated a lot in the global north within the environmental movement, that the problem is there are simply too many of us. And I think India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi answered that so eloquently way back in 1972 when she said, no, the problem is not that there are too many of us. The problem is that some of us are consuming far too much. And I think that density is not necessarily opposed to sustainability with justice. One could argue that, the cities that more and more of humanity lives in only take up about 1.5% of the Earth's surface. But of course, their footprint is very, very large, and they're sort of drawing in resources from everywhere else. I still think that urban density is a better path for the future than an American-style suburban sprawl.
I mean, take Indira Gandhi. I mean, she'd say to the West, the problem isn't that there's too many of us. The problem is distribution, and that you essentially want to inhibit the development of previously colonized countries because that's to your benefit. But also what she was doing domestically, like the forced sterilizations, kind of implied she thought something different on her home turf.
Absolutely. And I think that's the tragedy and the paradox of that moment, which I write about in The Burning Earth, which is that what she's saying to the West was not only eloquent, but it's still hard-hitting. Reading it now, it's still prescient and powerful. And yet it was completely belied by what she did in India. In fact, what her government did in India was fueled by exactly those kinds of anxieties that poor people were having too many children, that Muslims in India were having too many children. And these sterilizations were very specifically targeted at particular minorities within the country. And there was, in a sense, I think, an ecological anxiety that helped them to justify this, that we have to do this quickly. And I think that is something I worry about now, this idea that there's no time to lose. We're at the precipice. We have to do it fast. I mean, if there's one lesson I think that the second half of the 20th century has taught us, it is that justifying major political interventions with that argument that there's no time to lose is unlikely to have humane or democratic results.
We should definitely come back to that. I just want to kind of, return to the earlier portions of the book, because I was fascinated by the sections to do with the expansion of the Mongol Empire. Now, the Mongol Empire wasn't an empire the way many of our audience would understand it, right? There was a system of tribute. It was kind of complex. And it was also a nomadic empire. So it's not like the Romans who are like, all right, we're going to build these like Roman colonies in Barcelona. It's a bit different. But you do something which I think is like quite a Marxist approach, which is you look at the material basis for that empire and you say, well, it's grassland.
Yeah.
And some really good rainy years where you had a bumper crop of grass. I mean, what made you interested in the Mongols?
There have been two really wonderful. There was a wonderful book on the Mongols by Marie Favreau, which came out a couple of years ago, which is big picture history of the Mongols, which I found absolutely gripping. And then there's all this work by climate historians, including Nicolo di Cosma, showing us that run of years was particularly rainy. And this is. The material basis of the Mongol Empire lies in grass because it was a horse-mounted empire. And on one estimate, 1 in 4 horses in the world were in the Mongol army at that time. So you see how literally grass is at the origins of this power. And yes, the fortuitous run of good growing weather is not the cause of the Mongol Empire's expansion, but it would certainly have been a set of circumstances which, together with the rise of Genghis Khan, who was a very effective leader, not least in terms of managing what was also the Mongols' weakness, which was dynastic succession. It was often a very fratricidal mode of succeeding to the throne. I think we do need to think about the material basis of that empire, and then I think we need to think about its environmental effects. I started with the Mongol Empire because in some ways it is an empire that is flinging people and ecologies together, often very violently, but also through trade. And it is, its realm stretches across very, very distinct ecological zones. And I think you start to see a massive exchange of things that become valuable precisely because they come from different kinds of ecological zones.
I mean, did you find when you were studying the Mongols that when they encountered different landscapes, different ecologies, that they were transformed by that, or were they transforming the landscapes that they encountered?
You see that, I think, as a battle at the heart of the empire itself, because there was always a faction, and this is especially true when the Mongols invade China. There's a faction which says, let's turn these paddy fields into grazing land. literally, let's sort of raise it. And then there's a faction which prevails, which says, no, we actually need to accommodate ourselves to what China then was, which was the most productive and extensive agrarian society in the world.
And this is Kublai Khan, right? Who's dealing with all of this.
That's exactly right. And his brother, who insisted on traditional Mongol ways of using land, which would have involved the complete transformation of China's landscape.
And like, if Kublai Khan's brother had gotten his way, right, and so turn it all into pasture for horses, would that have meant an end to like silk production and like all of those things that we think of as being like the zenith of East Asian culture at that time?
I think it would. I think it would have, well, it would, for a start, I think it would have led to a dramatic population decline because, China, a third of people alive in the world at the time lived in China, and it was the productivity of rice agriculture which made that possible.
I mean, what many people will know about Kublai Khan is the Coleridge poem, right? Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. Did his contemporaries think he was a bit soft? Too interested in the silks, too interested in the nice Chinese stuff, and like not on horseback, as he should be?
There was definitely an element of that, and that is the conflict at the heart of the Mongol Empire as it's defining itself. The idea that he had adapted too much to luxurious, settled ways.
I mean, you mentioned rice. You're talking to a Bengali. I feel in my heart I know what's so special about rice, but from a like ecological perspective, what's so special about rice, and how did that become the staple of Asia as opposed to something else?
When you spend time in so many parts of South and Southeast Asia and East Asia now, it's hard to imagine that the rice fields were not always there. And there's so much a part of the landscape. And actually, rice makes its own journey. I mean, it starts in the Yangtze Valley of China, and through an extraordinary process which we only have traces of evidence to really reconstruct, it makes its way to Japan, to Korea. I think the current consensus is that autonomously and independently strains of wild rice began to be cultivated in the Ganges Valley of India. And very, very early on, those two strains start to come together. So we're talking about the movement of people, the movement of crops, the movement of ideas, so that by the first millennium, the Common Era, rice is the staple crop for so many parts of East and South India, southern China, Japan, Korea, and also places like Java and Bali. And rice is an amazing crop compared with wheat in particular, because you need very, very much less of it. You need to keep much less of the harvest for seed. And the other thing about rice is that rice soils improve rather than degrade over time. But there are also elements of rice, and there's a wonderful historian and anthropologist, Francesca Bray, who's still writing wonderful work on commodities and crops, but who in the 1980s wrote a lot about rice. And she makes a very interesting argument about how the differences between rice and wheat help us to understand the very different incentives at work in Western Europe and in Asia at the time in terms of how worthwhile it was to expand your land holdings. And the point about rice is it's very labor intensive. It takes a huge amount of artisanal skill to control the water to just the right level to get your harvest. And it didn't make sense necessarily for families to expand their holdings into estates like you get with Europe. Whereas wheat, partly because it grows on these heavier, more wintry European soils, lent itself to mechanization, and there were many more economies of scale involved. And so I think Francesca Bray's ideas, which others like Ravi Palat have developed since then, are profoundly interesting in terms of explaining some of the very, very big picture developments.
I mean, I'm being horribly reductive, but would there be an argument for if rice had been the staple in Europe instead of wheat, that you probably wouldn't have seen feudalism in the way that we did?
I think you could make that kind of argument. And yet that's such a cultural trope, the sort of rice eaters versus wheat eaters. I mean, the British in India were obsessed with this. They used that to racialize the Indian population in distinct kinds of ways. When you look at white supremacist labor unions in the US at the end of the 19th century, one of the arguments they use for Chinese exclusion is that we won't be reduced to the level of rice eaters.
What an insane thing to say about a delicious food.
Isn't it just? And I am a rice eater at heart as well. And I do think that rice has an emotional significance to people who grow up with it, which does feel to me intangible, though it is quite distinct from many other staples.
I think there's something about the paddy fields, about the tiered paddy fields, about, a woman up to her knees in water and bending down, which particularly for South Asians in the diaspora feels like such a potent image of home, even if they grew up in the middle of Kolkata or Bangalore or somewhere where it's like, there ain't no paddy fields here, babe. Like it's such a potent image of I guess the identity that you lost through displacement, whether it was in your generation or the ones before.
Absolutely. And that displacement may be just moving to Calcutta, or it may be moving across continents. And I think it's not an accident, I think, that there are rice goddesses in every single part of East, Southeast, and South Asia. And that even to this day, particular harvest festivals around rice are just very, very important to communities.
When we're thinking about the environmental view of history, right? We've talked about the Mongols and grass. So, bumper crop of grass sends them all over Asia. At one point they're conducting raids as far as Burma, right? Really, really far. I think that people can understand, it feels very intuitive to understand, that empires are also formed because someone else has got the thing you want, and you go take it, right? You go, okay, well, you're oil rich, or you're wheat rich, or you're rice rich, whatever it might be. Can privation, can not having, can famine, can blight also be a driver of empire expansion? So you're not thinking about the pull, you're thinking about the push.
You could make an argument that the origins of a lot of European expansion actually lies in privation. If you think about how much the Black Death decimates Europe, just the century before the Iberians start to move into the Atlantic world, a sense of privation also in Europe from feeling completely cut off from the valuable things that particularly Asian markets had to offer, driving people to try to find.
We just got the stupid wool. We'd like some of that nice silk.
Right. So it may not be privation itself that's driving it, but maybe the perceived privation twinned with the idea that someone else has it, and that maybe it's within reach. And that's the sort of series of steps that you start to see take over the European imagination. So at first, spices come from somewhere out there, loosely called India. And I saw your conversation with Willie Dalrymple about ancient India and how much of a magnetic impact it has on the world. But it's only later when a small number of Europeans start traveling through the Mongol Empire that they start to specify where these places are. And then Marco Polo writes in his travels, not having been there, that the island of Java is the richest place in the world. All the treasures that you might want are there. And Christopher Columbus is reading this, is annotating it. We have archival documents showing his margin notes, and it's like a siren.
Is there... You say something early on in the book where you talk about luxury goods, which is, luxury goods are chased by a small minority at first, and then they slowly widen their social reach, right? And then it's the sort of the grasping, aspirational middle classes and so on and so forth. Is there a part of you which feels suspicious of the way we as human beings want things? That there is something about our desire or our avarice which is destructive?
I think my sense is that human nature, if we want to identify it in a singular way, is so shaped by culture, society, and politics that I'm not sure that plays out in a uniform way in across time and across different societies. I think there are particular kinds of avarice which are not necessarily inherent, but which are created by political and economic circumstances, which are created by the availability of those things, which are created by the incentives that there are to go after those things, that perhaps drive that process in some cases, but not in others.
I hear you on your reluctance to make big claims about human nature, but I think there's something about that wanting, that feeling hungry even though you're fed thing, that I'm not sure is just culturally, politically, historically constituted. That there's something in us that's like...
I think you're right, at least intuitively I think you're right. And I think that is one of the things that the environmental movement has struggled with. What to do with that? How to either acknowledge it or work with it or try to mold it, because I think it is the case. And I suppose where I would see this happening is in many parts of Asia today, where the things that growing middle class wants have only been within reach for a decade or two. If you look at the Instagram posts of young people in Asia, so many of them are travel photographs because mass tourism has only just come to countries like China and India and Indonesia. And it's fine in Europe to talk about, the flight shame movement or all of these things, but it's very difficult to make that kind of argument in a context where this would have been unimaginable to be able to travel, to be able to, whether it's to go on holiday or to see the world or to explore, even not just in one's parents' generation, but even like a decade ago, for many of the people who can do it.
Because early on, I think it's a quote from a different writer, which is, the mansion of our freedom stands on, endless fossil fuels. So the freedom to travel, the freedom to see the world. And these are all things that we do think of as fulfilling and nourishing, right? We can be very snobby and turn our noses up as like, okay, you want to go to Dubai. But like if someone turned around and said to you, it's been my life dream to see the terracotta warriors, right? You wouldn't judge them for it, even though it's got such a massive carbon footprint. And you wouldn't really feel that comfortable to be like, no, you should stay in Hertfordshire.
I completely agree with you. And that is a wonderful sentence from Dipesh Chakrabarty. And this is a piece he published about 15 years ago. And I have to say the seeds of the burning earth have been me kind of turning that over and over again in my head. So many of the things that an increasing proportion of people in the world want have negative environmental consequences. Yes, they do. But, let's take flying. Hundreds of millions of people around the world are members of diasporas and transnational families. That itself is a result of the history that we talk about in The Burning Earth. It's not so straightforward a choice to fly less for people whose relatives might be on a different continent. Especially, and very often, the way in which those families are initially scattered is not even voluntary. That is the way. And so in that sense, isn't easy air travel a liberating and wonderful thing? Of course it is. And I think we wrestle with that. And I think we need to wrestle with that.
Let's carry on with the wrestling, right? Because, I was talking to somebody who said it would not be ecologically responsible to go to Venice, and actually tourists should stay away. And I felt a little bit stabbed under the gut because I'm obsessed with Renaissance Venice, right? I'm obsessed with all the plays that were written about it. I'm obsessed with imagining what the Doge was wearing. I'm obsessed with Renaissance Venice. And I felt a little bit like, well, I'm not going to the Costa Brava. I'm doing it for culturally enlightened reasons. And leaving aside the diaspora thing for a minute, because part of me would go, well, you know what? Maybe I would trade seeing my family in Kolkata for going to Venice. Maybe I would. But I guess, one of the things about technology is that it has made us see on our phones, on our laptops, just how much there is to be seen around the world. And it's difficult to say you can't go there, you can't experience it. I mean, do you think that is a choice deep down that you think we should be asking people to make? It's just politically inconvenient to do so.
I mean, I think two questions. One is who is asking who to make the choice? Very often those claims begin from at least social circles where that kind of travel has been within easy reach for generations, for a long time. And that claim is being made at a point when, yes, it is of course environmentally urgent, but at the same time, those choices are only just becoming available to many people around the world. And so I think my first question there is, who is going to decide this? And secondly, I would say one of the things that I was trying to do with The Burning Earth is maybe to try to shift us away from a very sometimes moralistic debate about individual choices, when the scale of the environmental problems that we face are systemic. And as we know, that, even that idea of your personal carbon footprint was popularized by BP. And clearly at that point, the idea was to turn this into a question of individual moral choice and not of regulation and taxation, which continues to be the scale at which I think any demonstrable impact can be made on these things.
I think I agree with you. And this is also the kind of thing that I say to my husband a lot when he's like, maybe we shouldn't fly to go on holiday. I'm like, you will not leave me cold in this fucking country, I swear to God. Don't you know that carbon footprint was invented by BP? And I will be saying all of that. But to kind of like be my own Jiminy Cricket for a second and put this back to you, which is, I think it's Leah EP who put it as, we never lose our fundamental freedom, which is the freedom to do what is right. And sure, we can say these are individualized choices and they're ways of letting big corporations and systems off the hook. But when I know deep down that there is a morality and a moral implication for me to, fly for leisure purposes when parts of Bangladesh are going to be rendered uninhabitable because of salinity intrusion or rising sea levels.
Yeah.
There's a moral dimension there that I can't escape.
And I think that's the right reason to make those choices, because they are intrinsically important moral choices that each of us make, and they are the choices that make us who we are. Rather than the argument that, your choices are necessarily going to shape the future trajectory of the climate crisis. I mean, I think those two things are actually compatible. We can say that actually it matters that we make these choices, that we discuss these choices, that we debate these choices in our families, in our communities, and at the same time understand that there are these much bigger systemic and structural forces at work which we can't avert our eyes from, and reducing these questions simply to questions of individual choice.
I want to move things on a bit, because one of the things that I found so interesting about the book is the way in which, by looking at commodities, and in particular things like wheat, meat, wool, it changed our sense of how wars have been won. So World War One, there's one story about how and why it was won. And then there's another one where you're like, well, no, actually, you had Canadian wheat, American meat, Australian wool. The Allies could win because they had an empire of stuff to draw on. Precisely the same empire that, the Germans were trying to establish. And because they couldn't quite do that, they kind of got fucked up in the long run. Like, did that surprise you when you were studying World War One?
What surprised me was how much time I spent on the two world wars in The Burning Earth. That was not the plan initially. There've been many good books written about both of those wars, but I really did start to see them as increasingly pivotal in the trajectory towards the levels of environmental destruction that we then see. I think that the two world wars, first of all, for the reasons that you say, their tentacles go everywhere. They are extracting timber, minerals, food, above all food, from all over the world. more or less willingly, perhaps in the case of, say, Canada or Australia, and with much more coercion when it comes to India and parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
I mean, I guess I was interested in, you look at, the Nazi project of Lebensraum, the expansion into Eastern Europe, which is both because of and justified by logic of racial superiority. But there's also, you've got loads of fucking wheat, and we need this wheat, to power this huge war machine. And on the other hand, you've got Winston Churchill, who is still exporting all of this grain from India during the Bengal famine. Do you see much of a difference between how the British perceived Bengal and how the Nazis perceived Eastern Europe at this time? Was there a big difference in how these powers saw these other regions?
I think it's a difference in degree, not kind. I think you don't see within the British Empire in India at that time the sheer level of ideologically driven murderousness that you see in the Nazi regime. But, I mean, Churchill is on record saying, let the Bengalis starve. There was a very clear sense that Indian bodies, Indian crops were there to serve the empire. And
I guess, was the idea of racial superiority a way of justifying what was a horrible and murderous decision, or was the horrible murderous decision only possible because he thought of these people as racially inferior?
The latter, I think. I think there's an entire worldview, and we still grapple with this question, whose lives matter. And Bengalis' lives don't matter to the policymakers in the British Empire. There are lower level officials in Bengal who are crying for help. These are British officials who are writing to London saying, you cannot let this happen. And they're ignored. Their memos are put to one side and move on.
I mean, you write about the way in which cattle pasture, particularly in America and in Argentina, it was part and parcel of a genocidal project. I mean, for people who aren't familiar with those periods of history, I mean, just what was the impact of something like, buffalo hunting and clearing that land for cattle grazing in America? What did that mean for indigenous people?
In many parts of the Americas, the United States, in the prairie, but also in Argentina and the Pampas, what it meant was literally a reshaping. We talked about the Mongols. In a sense, it's the same kind of imperial mentality. We need to make this land into something else. We need to make this land into grazing ground for our cattle. And that means taking the land away from the people who inhabited it, whose lands they were. It meant exterminating an entire species, the buffalo in the case of the United States, on which their lives and livelihoods depended. And it meant literally displacing them. Starvation followed in many cases, and the language of genocide is not too strong at all, I think, to describe what is happening, for example, to indigenous groups in the Pampas of Argentina.
I mean, you said that it's an imperial mentality of we're gonna make this land something else. When you hear a phrase, and this is used in relation to Israel, both by Israelis and also Israel's advocates internationally, we made the desert bloom. Does it prick your ears up a bit when you hear something like that?
It does. There's a wonderful paragraph near the beginning, I think, of Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, where he's ventriloquizing the view of a former imperial official, and that's what the imperial official, the character in Coetzee's novel, says. After everything we've done, we made the desert bloom. These people are turning on us. And so I do think there is that idea of environmental control as both a tool for political domination, but also it comes to be seen as justifying political domination, because then we get into the ideas that, and you see this in 17th, 18th century America, where what are the arguments used for dispossessing Native Americans? It's that they're not using the land properly. It's that they are not productive. It's that there are only certain ways. And then this idea, which of course is very much part of our contemporary political discourse too, this idea of wasteland. That has such a colossal environmental impact on the world. The idea that some lands, and of course it's a political claim to call something a wasteland. It is a claim to say that someone else is not doing what I think they should do with it, so I'm going to take it over. And you see this in 19th century India as well. And it is how the commons are degraded.
I mean, there's something deeply ironic that T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is about Europe after World War I. He's like, the wasteland, it's London, it's Paris, it's these centres of civilization. I mean, to kind of come back to this idea of I guess the role of ecocide in projects of settler colonialism is, and coming back to Israel, there was a forensic architecture investigation which found that since 2014, Palestinian farmers close to Gaza's perimeter have had their crops sprayed by airborne herbicides. They're regularly bulldozed. They themselves have faced sniper fire. And this was all before October 7th, so you can only imagine what that is now. Do you see, not just in relation to Israel, but more broadly, that ecocide is still being used as a tool of dispossession and imperial expansion?
Absolutely. And I think if we go back to the origins of that term ecocide, it was first used around 1970 in relation to the US war in Vietnam. And it was actually a plant biologist, Arthur Golston, who used this phrase in Washington in 1970 to describe the use of Agent Orange. Of course, the effects of Agent Orange are still affecting Vietnamese bodies to this day. No compensation, no acknowledgement. 30, 40 years of struggle to have that acknowledged. And when Golston coined that term, I think the allusion to genocide was very explicit. And the question he posed, it haunts me now still, is does any country ever have the right to destroy the environment of another?
And it feels that the answer the world's governments have come to is, well, yeah, if we're doing it.
Pretty much.
I mean, I know that we're like sort of like deep in the dark bit right now, but just to kind of like keep plugging along with it. When you look at the butcher's bill of world history, right, the deaths of humans, plant species, animal species, do you see a story of progress, or do you see a story of something else?
Do see a story of progress in the historical record in some ways. I think that story of progress is sort of antithetical to the butcher's bill in many ways. Where I see stories of progress in the starkest possible terms, and this is one of the things I start with in The Burning Earth, life expectancy in India and Indonesia in 1947-48 was about 30 years. Infant mortality was over 200 in 1,000. In those ways, in those expansions, in the most basic possibilities of human life, I see progress. But in the butcher's bill, I see a road to ruin.
What about something like air conditioning? Symbol of progress or not?
Air conditioning is a brilliant example of the kinds of dilemmas we were just talking about earlier, Ash, because 80% of American households had air conditioning by the end of the 1970s. 80% of American households had air conditioning by the end of the 1970s. Now, middle-class households in North India are buying air conditioning units at quite a rapid rate. And yes, we know air conditioning is a very harmful technology. But at a moment when air conditioning is becoming, I would argue, not a luxury, but a necessity in a part of the world where these extremes of heat are starting to approach 50 degrees Celsius every summer, we could turn that around and say air conditioning is a necessity. And that brings us back to this question, well, then for whom is it not a necessity? For whom is it a luxury? And can we really tell middle-class families in the global south not to buy their air conditioning units when, like I said, it's not only a matter of comfort, but increasingly it's a matter of health. It's a matter of security in terms of the security of families from these increasingly dangerous extremes.
Well, I agree with you, but I also sort of flip the question back, which is, of course, it's a necessity when the model is every country has to look like America one day. And that's going to be the model of your economy. That's going to be the model of your consumption. That's going to be the model of your habitus, your life world. All right. Like no more siestas, because actually that you can't have a joined up office between, Mumbai and New York if like someone takes an afternoon nap and someone else doesn't. All of those things have to be the same. Whereas if you go, all right, well, maybe instead of air conditioning units, you look at the sort of histories of like vernacular architecture. Or, you build like a riad and you have like, the fountain in the middle, which is what, they used to do in Morocco, and you live differently, right? You do not work in the hottest part of the day. Then you don't need the air conditioning. But what that means is that you are no longer on a path of ever closer alignment between, developing countries and what used to be the imperial core.
And I think you're absolutely right, Ash. It is within the current system, I would make an argument that air conditioning is increasingly a sort of bodily necessity for people. But the alternatives lie just where you said, which is there is this moment in the 1950s and 60s where in a completely ecologically and culturally inappropriate way, these concrete buildings are being exported all over the world and built to a particular kind of design. And those are the kinds of buildings that do need air conditioning. Those are the kind of buildings that don't have much older ways of living with heat. Caveat there is, I think the extremes of heat are becoming far, far greater than perhaps they have ever been before. But nevertheless, I think, yes, if the entire rhythm of life were to be opened up to living with the rhythms of nature, of seasons, and indeed even of a changing climate, then you wouldn't need air conditioning everywhere. And you might even start taking out air conditioning units in some places. Very interesting experiments going on with that in places like Hawaii. Hawaii is a very interesting example. Colonized by the United States, a place where there were deep traditions of vernacular architecture, which were marginalized for a one-size-fits-all model of building a city like Honolulu on the model of Los Angeles.
And McMansions in the jungle, which is like, well, I mean, I suppose wanted to come back to something you talked about, which was the enclosures, right? And just how important the enclosures were for the sort of the privatization of land, and who gets to use it and who doesn't, what rights you have on the land, the contingencies of those rights. Do you ever look back on the period of the English Civil War and, the period of the levelers and the diggers, and you go, that was kind of a sliding doors moment, right? Things could have been really different if at that point how political freedoms were integrated with ecological rights, that could have changed everything going down the line.
I like that idea of sliding doors. I think that may well be one such moment. And I think there are other such moments that one can see where...
Like what? What are your other sliding doors moment? Like if we made a different choice or a different faction had won out, human history could look radically different.
I feel like there are so many sliding doors moments in the middle of the 20th century around the process of decolonization. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why so many of my students are doing this brilliant work on the kind of alternative futures that were pushed to one side through the process of decolonization. Futures which in the 1920s and 30s, I have a wonderful student called Calvin Ung who's looking at these radical claims for equality that Islamic reformers and anti-caste reformers and the labor movement are all making in relation to one another in Southeast Asia and South Asia in 1920s and 30s. And there are so many other people who've looked at paths not taken in the 1940s and 50s. And I think one of them is a path away from the kind of mega development, from the very sort of top-down approach to catering for people's livelihoods that might, like the moment you talked about, Ash, have set us on a path where human well-being and human flourishing and ecological flourishing might have been somewhat less divorced from one another.
I mean, I want to put a question to you, because as I was reading this book, another book popped up into my head, and I was like, it's like these two books could have a debate if only they could speak. And it was my colleague, Aaron Bastani, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And I think that if he were here, he would say, well, what I'm proposing isn't about living beyond ecological limits. It just changes what those limits are. And he talks about technologies like asteroid mining, vertical farming, cultured meat, and that these things could usher in a new age of abundance and a new age of freedom. And it would be powered by, solar and hydro and wind. What do you make of arguments like that? Do you go, yeah, that sounds about right? Or do you go, you're just trying to cheat the house again, right? You think that you can let this run of good luck keep running, whereas it has to run out. Like nature's going to spring back and say, no more.
One question that comes to my mind is actually how that would work in a society like India, which has struggled to provide basic employment, where 80% of the population is not even informal employment, is in the informal sector, as they call it. I'm open to persuasion, but it would be I do try to imagine that scenario playing out in a country like India, and I struggle to see how it would.
I'm gonna rack my brains for the bits of his book that I can remember. I mean, Aaron might argue, well, actually, countries which don't have a national grid system like the UK's are better placed for some of this stuff, because you've got a less centralized energy system means that switching to solar panels, which are much more locally generated forms of energy, that's a lot easier, and to put it very crudely, like India, Nigeria, a lot sunnier than the UK. That's what he might say, that actually maybe these countries are better placed rather than worse placed. But you're saying the problem is that because you have the impoverishment of so much of the population, you do not have a workforce which is capable of delivering that yet, certainly not within a generation.
Aaron and I'm sure would agree that the biggest question is in whose hands these technologies are. And at the moment, I see them being used to deepen inequalities and to intensify environmental exploitation and degradation.
I mean, I agree with that, but think about it. Soviet Russia takes you from peasant farming to, outer space in not very long. Miracles of development can happen. Miracles
of development can happen, but those very miracles of development have been amongst the most environmentally destructive in the 20th century. So that would certainly be a caution to bear in our minds, I think, as we imagine other futures. I think we have to imagine other futures. And I think what is attractive about an idea like this is that it doesn't say we have to abandon so many of the things that we value and that people are struggling towards.
Back to the caves and the whelks, lads. Get out of your home.
That is actually... There are some in the environmental movement who are making those kinds of arguments.
What if you're allergic to whelks?
What if you're allergic to whelks? When you hear, well, actually the carrying capacity of the Earth is 2 billion people. Tell me how we're going, tell me more. But of course, those who are making those arguments are not necessarily following them through to their logical conclusions.
So I suppose my final question is this, which is earlier you said that you are instinctively suspicious when someone says, this is so urgent, we've got no time, because downstream of that is some kind of atrocity. But of course, when it comes to climate change, the fact that everything we're seeing now is the result of carbon we've put into the atmosphere decades and centuries ago.
Absolutely.
And we're still pumping even more carbon into the atmosphere, which means that like future generations, it could be like kind of Mad Max Fury Road kind of scenario. How can you not be urgent, and how can you not use those kinds of imperatives to sort of, kick the system of political economy into gear?
I feel an overwhelming sense of urgency about the place we're in right now. And I think it's how you square that with other values that we hold dear. I mean, I suppose maybe we take one step back and say, well, why is the climate crisis a problem? Well, the climate crisis is a problem because it imperils and endangers the viability and the dignity and the possibilities of human lives around the world, and particularly of the lives of those who have the least privilege. And I think that set of values is important to keep in our minds, even while we emphasize the urgency, because I think it's just, there are too few steps between this is urgent, we have to sort it out now, to the kinds of policies that would actually forget why we're so alarmed and worried about this in the first place.
I suppose the thing which I've been trying to wrestle with, and this is about challenging my own politics and the assumptions they rest on, which is when I'm presented by people who are, very anti-net zero or something like that, I say some version of, well, maybe you have less of the things that you want, but you have more of the things that you need. And if you ask someone what's more important, a pretty little thing dress or a house you could afford, maybe they'd pick the house. And I try and make out that it's, it's all good. But ultimately, rich people, and I count myself in this, even if I'm not rich in terms of the UK, globally, right? We're all pretty rich. We'll have to consume less, right? Even if we're consuming different things, more nutritious things, but we have to consume less. And I wonder if we're squeamish about that because people balk. People balk at that fact. And then we try and do all these mad contortions to conceal it, but everyone can see that we're contorting.
I completely agree with you. There is absolutely no alternative to rich people consuming less. And because that is such a difficult proposition, I mean, that is why it has been so difficult to mobilize political consensus around the kinds of steps that we need to take. But there's a very interesting piece in Nature Climate Change that has just come out about how both people in the top 10% of the income distribution and people at the bottom of the income distribution in 5 countries, including India, Nigeria, and countries in the global north, dramatically underestimate the carbon impact of the rich. So even poorer people underestimate how much more than them the wealthiest portion of society is responsible for not only the climate crisis, but the whole series. And so the question is, well, does the answer then lie in actually making that very, very clear to people so that perhaps more of a consensus can build around that certainty? I think that, the top however many percent in the world, which, as you rightly point out, is not just, the 1% in the UK, but that in some sense, anyone who lives in the global north, all of us, are globally speaking in that sort of upper tier. And it is striking that even those at the bottom of the income distribution, this is also true in Nigeria and it's true in India, are massively underestimating how much more those at the top are contributing to the climate crisis.
I feel like the ghost of Robespierre is looking down, being like, so you got a troublesome top 1%. I got a solution for that. You're not going to like it. Sunil Amrith, thank you so much for joining us today on Downstream.
Ash. It's been great.